Hello, everybody. All right. Nice to see you all out here. Thank you for coming through. We are about to have a beautiful conversation. Hope all of us together, right? So I am Samiya Bashir. I'm a poet, a writer, author of Field Theories, and a few other books, and executive director of Lambda Literary, and we are the nation's LGBTQ plus literary arts extravaganza organization. And I'm thrilled to be here with two beautiful writers and people. And we're going to start by hearing a little bit from their work. And I'll introduce them both first, and then Jafari will share with us. And then I'm coming back for you, Robert. Okay. So we are here with Professor Dr. Jafari Allen, Jafari Sinclair Allen, Professor of African American and African Diasporic Studies at Columbia University. He is the incoming director of the Columbia University Institute for Research in African American Studies. Dr. Allen is also the new editor of the Columbia, AADS, those things I just said, journal, Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. Okay, so thank you. Please thank. Yes, Institute for Research in African American Studies. I'm here for it. Robert Jones Jr. is the author of the New York Times best-selling novel, The Prophets, a finalist for the 2021 National Book Award for Fiction. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Essence, and Variety, as well as in the critically acclaimed anthologies 400 Souls and The 1619 Project. Please help me welcome Robert Jones Jr. So what I didn't get to say about Jafari is he is also the author of the recent, also critically acclaimed, also shortlisted for the Lambda Literary Award, I might say, book, There's a Disco Ball Between Us, A Theory of Black Gay Life. And it's fire, just so you know. And I'm really grateful will you grace us and we can hear a little bit of something?
Thank you.
Some of it. Welcome, Jafari.
Thank you. I put a timer on so that I will be brief and so that we can get to the discussion. But thank you so much, Samiya. Thank you, Robert, for being here. It's an honor for me to be here and to be a writer. As an academic, we're not always writers, but I'm a writer, and I feel great surrounded by these two who, in another instant, could also be theorists. That is, when I think about how to think about the human condition, how to think about love and loss and wonder, I may pick up field theories, but I may also pick up that first little beautiful book, The Apple Falls.
Where the apple falls, yes.
And I was also telling Robert we met today for the first time, but what he doesn't know is that the literature, how in the classroom we use literature to help people theorize. And we open the prophets, and in the beginning, we get Psalms. And you think, what is this writer trying to tell us? And then those characters tell us things. Those characters bring us to a historical period that is telling us something about the Black condition, the human condition, about love. And so I'm going to read a short piece from There's a Disco Ball Between Us that is, like most of the book, sort of exploding genre. I'm an anthropologist. But some of this is more like memoir, some is history, some is literary theory. And so I'm going to begin. Chapter 3 is called Other Countries, and this section is called Masked Black Gay Men for Masked Black Gay Man. And this is how it goes. If James were here, he could better tell you how I behaved at the GMAD-sponsored premiere reading of The Road Before Us, 100 Black Gay Poets, where I met Donald Woods for the first time. Donald towered that evening, languid, lean, and elegant in language and body, brilliant and sibilant. I remember attempting amateurish come-hither looks. Donald declined graciously with a warm, nice try, little brother. I swooned. Black gay men longing for a mirror made of flesh saw ourselves for perhaps the first time in the literature of the long 1980s. But what of those reflections? Were they aspirational, honest? Were they just? And how did those reflections, whether honest and affirming or not, serve as blackprints for the movement fomenting in tandem in organizations like GMAD? The erotic is certainly constituting, but it can also breed deeply consequential exclusions. The poetic brother-to-brother confession of Carrie Ellen Johnson, whom I first met at GMAD and to whom I personally owe a great deal for his mentorship in the early 90s, predates my own. In Hey Brother, What's Happening, Carrie wrote that, quote, "Everybody wants to be the boy next door and have the boy next door, and I am no exception." To me, this typifies the structure of feeling at GMAD in the early 80s. The fact that everyone seemed cute and educated or on their way, or middle class or aspiring, was a lure and lubrication for sociality among those who thought of themselves likewise, and I am no exception. Tragically, this would also prove to be a trap, or more precisely, a lack of political consciousness around what to do with this confluence of class, sexual, and gender desires and performance is the trap. In the early 1990s, GMAD's transformation had as much to do with the perceived shifts in class position, education, looks, and presentation of the folks who increasingly accessed the services of the organization and populated the Friday night forums as they were a result of the vagaries of national and municipal HIV funding. And then I give you some background on that, blah, 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 and then I return to the story. Returning to that night at the 100 Black Gay Poets reading, Carlos Segura's poem Classified, collected in the anthology, put middle-class mask-for-mask dip politics right on the line, way ahead of AOL chat rooms, Craigslist, and innumerable apps that glibly provide headlines that anticipate the inevitable question, what do you like? What are you into? In my mind, I can still hear Carlos reading. He starts out seductive and romantic. Wanted, a man, to hold me during thunderstorms so I won't shiver anymore. Fuck through blizzards so I could keep warm. I remember the place went up when he delivered the next stanza at the standing room only reading. White men need not apply. Then black mask romance turns again. He writes, knowledge of snap finger theories, girlfriend language, or cha-cha queenologies need not apply. Essentially, no femmes. As if writing the 2009 Morehouse College appropriate dress policy to come some 20 years in the future, a perfect storm of black bourgeois anxieties that made women's clothing and accessories, sagging jeans and grills, each verboten and imagined as of a piece, the sexy black gay Dominican poet from Brooklyn pushed further, quote, philosophies of bebopism, dickholdism, or homeboy talkism not required. Note, not required. But this poetic, erotic job advertising suggests that unlike the white boy or the femme, a dick-holding homeboy is already trainable for employment in black gay romance, coming with something extra. Homeboy to black boho homo. We went up, hollered, laughed, clapped, cheered, and certainly some also snapped. However, there's an ethical, that is, a political danger in this pleasure that I did not recognize at the time. It is hard to hear the wisdom of the accented diva over the deafening rhythm of one's own masked blood beat. There's more. This author is not ashamed of his desire for or to become Joe or Carrie or Len or Maurice or Melvin if I had been paying attention. Still, we must question both the presumption of butch queen leadership of the movement and how masculinity moves us. To where? You will not be surprised, dear reader, dear listener, that Essex had already theorized some of the contradictions and complexities of dip politics in poems such as Family Jewels, his epic Heavy Breathing, and perhaps most directly and complexly implicating the speaker himself and all of us caught in the irresistible allure of complex, contradictory black masculinity, his stunning black machismo. Here, Essex begins with one already faceted aspect of debilitating dick politics. Metaphorically speaking, his black dick is so big, when it stands up erect, it silences the sound of his voice. It obscures his view of the territory, his history, the cosmology of his identity is rendered invisible. You'll have to read more. You'll have to buy the book to read my analysis, but I'd like to end with Essex.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, Jafari. All right, Robert, thank you.
Thank you. That was such a wonderful reading, Jafari. The Prophets, for people who don't know, is the love story between two enslaved young men on a plantation in Mississippi. And the reason why I wrote this book is because Toni Morrison said, if you can't find the book you wish to read, then you must write it. And I could not find any direct evidence of the existence of queer ancestors in the canon. I subsequently found those testimonies orally and in African traditions, but not written down except under the contexts of rape and sexual assault. And my question was, well, what about love? So in the Prophets, Samuel and Isaiah are in love in a plantation, and it's about how their love transform and vex other members of that community. But in order to establish a lineage for Samuel and Isaiah, that is to say, to push back against the idea that it was slavery itself that made black people queer, which is a lie, I went back even further to an earlier couple named Alewa and Kosai to tell their love story too, such that it mirrors Samuel and Isaiah's. And here in this section, I'll be reading from a middle passage where Kosai and Alewa are trapped on this ship. I'll be brief. The ship bellowed before it dipped down and then back up again, and things rolled from one side to the other. Kosai listened to the cycle, something, maybe a cup, clinking, then rumbling to the opposite wall and clinking again. Perhaps in another place, at another time, the noise would soothe him, be some sort of nighttime song into which he could dream. And in the dreaming, he and Alewa led the hunt, capturing grand and succulent pheasant, which they cleaned and made into a stew. Uncle Ketwa had taught him how to season, and so every bit of meat was sucked from the bones, and there wasn't a drop of stock left. They fed each other roasted banana, which Alewa liked smashed and mixed with mango and coconut water. They were too tired to clean up, so they left the mess for tomorrow and gazed at each other lazily, smiling like drunkards, until the darkness and the smell of impending rain had pushed them into each other's arms. "What shall we do with the feathers?" Alewa asked. "Let us make you a crown." But it was daytime, and the light once again barged into the room, and the two skinless men stomped down the stairs and surveyed the captives. They walked all the way over to the far end, holding their noses, walking uncarefully, not paying attention to whom they were climbing over or who they stepped on. One of them moved ahead into the far corner where the light couldn't reach, where rats played, where there was human silence and the air of rot. Body after body hefted and carried out to be tossed aside like food gone sour. Not even the dignity of a pyre. He counted the bodies: 3, 8, 12, then number 17. And the words couldn't leave his lips, stuck in the crevices of his mouth and tying his tongue. He wanted to scream, but a lump lodged itself into his throat, and the air couldn't flow. He coughed until tears finally, from somewhere, somehow ran, and the saliva too leaked, and his face pulled itself into foolishness. Alewa's body had managed to maintain its beauty. Aside from some bruises and his half-open eyes, he looked like he was enjoying a princely slumber. He had been carried higher above their heads. Had he been carried higher above their heads, it would have taken on the character of a celebration, reaching puberty, the first hunt, the calling of the ancestors, the crowning of a king. Kosai stretched out his arms as far as the chains would allow before the rusty metal dug into his wrists and droplets of blood hit the floor. It was almost intentional. The arc, the spilling of blood formed, the perfect circles themselves forming a larger circle, almost a head, almost a tail, almost infinity closing in on itself just right there at the bottom beneath all notice. They were jumbled when they came out, his words. Mixed in with his drizzle, they were only clear to him. A curse upon you and all of your progeny. May you writhe in ever pain. May you never find satisfaction. May your children eat themselves alive. But it was too late. The curse held no meaning because it was redundant. Kosai's hands fell to his sides. Disaster, he thought. A pure, plain disaster. Not only because of what he had already lost, but also because of what he would have to lose. He had, after all, made Elewa's 7 aunts a promise. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if y'all noticed what we do to the weather here, but as he was reading, a whole windstorm came through.
The ancestors, that's them.
Right, and then came through again, just to be clear, in case you missed it, the first time. Thank you, Robert. Woo, welcome to the 5th Annual Schomburg Center Literary Festival, honey, honoring the rebellious and joy-filled privilege and necessity of reading. I'm really grateful for what both of you all shared. I have so many places I want to start. I mean, I kind of want to start with because Toni Morrison said so as everything. But I want to lead that into maybe my first question, which is about, and as we're thinking through kind of Black queer literary history, what does that mean? Where does it come from? Black feminist poetics of things, as Jafari has written about so beautifully, is the naming, right? In There's a Disco Ball Between Us, we have the photographs even, taking a shot of every moment, the naming of everyone who was there in conversation again and again, the attributions, the citations, the acknowledgments. If you haven't seen the acknowledgments in this book, it's a community call. It's like, oh no, this is everybody and who and why, and thank you, and it's a really kind of a beautiful poetics of itself. And I want to ask you all about that. Maybe you read What About Love, which takes me to bell hooks too, since the question of Black feminism was poised for this conversation. And I wonder if we can bridge the naming and the question, what about love, from both of these readings into a how do you get there and why is that important?
I'm thinking in your desire to link naming with the what about love, I'm thinking of our transgender siblings and how often they're dead named as a sign of disrespect,
Yes.
a refusal to acknowledge who you decide you are, and how, for me, that's so connected to slavery.
Yes.
Because the first things the slave masters did when they snatched our ancestors up from where they were and forced them to labor for free is they renamed them. Forget your Yoruba name, your Igbo name, your Zulu name. You are now this Christian name. And it was precisely Christian because we wanted you to also forget your gods and forget your spirituality and forget your ancestors. And we're gonna replace it with this white Jesus. And so you will know from every level, even from your very name, that you are my property. You lost. You are of the conquered, and you are subjugated.
Yes.
So why naming is so very important for me, thinking about it in a trans politics, is because it's the desire to take back your own autonomy, your right to name yourself, your right to exist as you see fit, as opposed to someone else's gaze. And for me, that is the most profound act of love, because love for me always starts with the self. It has to be turned inward before you can project it outward. And I think that's why love in America is so difficult, is because so many people in America don't love themselves, and how I know that is because of how they treat their children. Because if you can be a politician who says, I don't want my children to know history, I'm going to take all these books out of the schools, I don't care what you say, you hate that child. You hate your children. And so the act of love for me is reclaiming all of that and giving myself my own name.
Well, all right. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think that's precisely right, and the question of linking love to naming, to citation, to rememory, to unburial. So clear for me as someone who, academics, we are asked to go to archives, unearth the truth of the ages, those of us in the humanities, like there's truth there. Or those of us who are social scientists like me, you are going back and you're trying to look at every piece of something and try to think through what these pieces are. And the question of Black gay literature, Black queer literature, Black literature is also in recovering who was there, what they did, what our connections to them are, because they are not as easily accessible. Those of us who live in this city or who know about that building on the corner have this building on the corner. This is a glittering hill. This is a sacred place where our loves and our lives are archived. The evidence is there, but the evidence is not widely available. The evidence of those, especially in the late 70s to the 1990s, the period that I talk about here, whose lives were lost to cancer, to HIV/AIDS, and to violence, those people many times died before telling their stories, or people telling their stories. So it becomes incumbent on us to tell their stories. So the act of love, and it's connected also when I began thinking about the prophets in relation to this, that again, it is Ms. Morrison's notion of writing the story that you don't, that you want to read, but it is also, who do you love? How did you become who you became? I became who I became because there was a little book, for many reasons, but one reason, there was this little book that I had that I hid in a locker, in a trunk, along with a little porno magazine. But what was more important to me than a porno magazine was Other Countries, and was In the Life, and it was Joseph Beam's face on the back cover that imagined everything for me. And so this notion of who you love, or who you want, the desire, which is something that is often not discussed in academic work, is so key to Black gay literature, Black queer literature, what we call it, the naming, we can call it Black feminist poetics. The conversation of what we call it is important, but one of the things that I'm most interested in is thinking about the habit of mind that creates it. The habit of mind that creates that, when we talk about the acknowledgments, you ain't supposed to have acknowledgments like that. And, in the first novel, just say this is to mama and go on, right? But that's not what he has. My acknowledgments is a chapter.
Right.
I mean, it's not just, it is a chapter because it had to be. Because I had to name people, but also because I had to tell the truth about the people who ignored the work, who didn't want to hear it, who thought, if you're an anthropologist, do anthropology, what is this gay shit, right? So it becomes something that has to be part of the record, calling of the role.
That's right. That's
Amen.
right. Thank you. Well, so then, Jafari, and I have a part B here for you coming, Robert, too, but I want to push even further on this idea of the living and the dead, right? The unburial.
Yeah.
And in two directions. First, you mentioned the black gay habits of mind, which you write about and cite about in this book. But also, like, what it do? Like, all of this work, this unburial, this name, like, what does it do for us?
One of the things that it does for us, I can say personally, what it does for me is it grounds me in a recognition of not only who I've become, but the various me's I could have been. What it do is it do be telling the truth about the those of us who are left out of other stories. It fills in. It tells another truth. It allows a pat story to become a more complex story, a more true story. It fills us in a way. I just saw a clip of Maya Angelou talking about romance, and she's talking about the romance of seeing someone, or the every time I see Samiya that I can't help but smile and want to kiss and smell her because she always smells so good. So one of the things that it does is it reminds us of our humanity and our connection to each other as people who are not just checking a box, right? Thank you. Thank you to the thank you to folks
John
for
Leslie.
giving the signs. I'm putting these people on payroll at Columbia because it's fantastic.
Cards are being gotten. So thank you, Jafari. And Robert, if we can continue this idea of the living and the dead, I might want to, your very first chapter in The Prophets challenges that, after innocence we have discovered is the most serious atrocity of all, it is what separates the living from the dead. That chapter concludes with, haha, forgive our laughter. You thought you were the living and we were the dead? Haha. And I just would love to kind of, if you could open that up, furthering the conversation.
Well, social media sort of influenced that idea for me, where, and I'm no longer on social media for this very reason. If you ever notice the discourse that is had on social media, it's always like accountability is for everyone except me. Like I'm always above accountability. I can't be held accountable. I'm always innocent. And so for me, the real currency on social media is how do I get innocence? How am I never the one that's implicated? How am I always on the end where I'm pointing, not recognizing, like my great-grandmother used to say, 3 of those fingers are pointing back at you. And so what I wanted to tie that idea to was the idea of life, which is messy and complex and cyclical and never a straight line, and how we when you're saying you want to hold somebody else accountable, who are you holding accountable first should always be yourself. In Christian language, it would be he who cast the first stone. That sort of idea. And so what I thought was, who would actually be the group or the people who are able to come to terms with this, recognize it, and accept their guilt, and no longer have an allegiance to this idea of innocence, and that would be the dead. And then I said to myself, well, would that make them the real living people, and maybe really the dead, at least in psychological terms? And so that was my attempt to sort of dramatize that conflict.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to open us up to questions, but maybe we can kind of, while you all think through, maybe write out a question or two, or think it up in your mind. Maybe one last thing from me, which is, I just want to introduce, if we're thinking about the living and the dead, what I also see is the elements so very strongly, which is a thing that, I personally have a minor obsession with. But, obviously the water and the water and the water and the water, Robert. We have the sea water, the river water, the well water, the middle passage. But also last night a disco saved my life, right? And what does that mean when you take us from night into morning again and then into morning again and again? And I'm curious, I want to connect that to this kind of the beautiful mess of our bodies and how you're writing through that, how you think through writing through that in an antebellum moment, how you think through writing that in a moment of, atrocity that was HIV/AIDS.
That is a question that I'm actually often asked. And I took sort of a page from Morrison in that sense, recognizing that slavery is not the story. Slavery is the backdrop, it's the setting. But the story were these ancestors who were people, not slaves. That's why you'll never hear me refer to our ancestors as slaves. They were enslaved. Somebody did something to them. They were not slaves, which erases their personhood. Yes, the slave masters attempted to diminish the humanity of our ancestors, and in effect diminish their own humanity, because that's what happens, Baldwin says, when you try to diminish someone else's humanity. You're really doing nothing to the other person. You're only showing the world how monstrous you are.
Right.
So in order to deal with something like antebellum slavery, I had to recognize, one, that antebellum slavery is not the story, and that I had to ensure that the Samuels, the Isaiahs, the Sarahs, and everyone else, Maggie, were full, rounded human beings with lives and stories and joys and fears and laughter, like I know my ancestors to have had. Because when we think of somebody being enslaved, we think that obviously they're chained up, so it must be always sorrow. But if it was always sorrow, if our ancestors couldn't find in secret their own pleasures, they could not have survived.
Right.
And so we always see this history from the white gaze, but we never consider it from the black perspective of what slavery was like. We always see, probably because of Uncle Tom's Cabin, we think of slavery in one particular way, and that was propaganda that needed to be written at that time to show white people how horrible that institution was. But as a black person, and particularly as a black queer person, I want to disturb all of those boundaries and those lines, and I want to kind of turn the camera back onto the people for whom I want to hear their testimony.
Yes.
My job is to be a witness,
Yeah.
and that was what I was attempting to do in that book, despite the horrors of it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just quickly before the question and answer, that my job is also to be a witness, and Melvin Dixon had this wonderful line where he talked about avoiding double cremation. Right? So double cremation is about a story, a person's life. A person dies, their physicality dies, but then the story of their life is also forgotten, incinerated, as if they were never there. And so my witness is also to say, these folks were here, and they were not only here as people who my students, will, this hagiography of someone like Audre Lorde or Essex Hempel, et cetera, of course, for all of them. And at the same time, they were also people, right? So what does it do? One of the things that it does is it also says to us that genius is not only their genius, right, but it is something that we can tap into. It is something that we can cultivate, and all of our genius, everything that we create, everything that we are, is worthy of saving, is worthy of consideration, is worthy of sharing with other people.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. And not that genius and that joy.
And the joy.
You know, that they can both be found. I mean, you said where rats play, even in the mire. You know, there's still play, even from what you might most find horrifying.
Absolutely.
And you know, so I want to open this up to y'all's questions. What might you think? And if you say it loud, I'll say it back so we all hear it. Yes. Yeah, you. Thank you. Hello, sir.
Hi, how are you? My question is for Robert, but I'd also like to already answer it as well if you can. So one of the things you just spoke about was the fact that, Toni Morrison spoke to how we were not slaves. Slavery was the backdrop, right? And I think that in The Prophets you did a marvelous job of speaking that life into your characters, right? But in the daily tragedies of being black and queer in America, how do you maintain your wholeness and your ability to do that work?
Excellent. Thank you for that
That
question.
That is a great.
So I'm just going to say that again, not all the way, but really thinking on Toni Morrison's idea that slavery was not the story but the backdrop. How do you, as a writer, creating this work, maintain your wholeness through the horrors and brilliance of Black life today?
Well, I have the blessing of brotherhood. Fred, Tariq, Joel, Dante, Mateo, and my list goes on. Sisterhood, Nafisa, Disha, Donnie, and the list goes on of these people who see my whole self and love it. Not just the good pieces, not just, and Irv, I forgot Irv. Not just the good pieces, but the messy ones, the flawed ones, the human and vulnerable ones, who then, because they love me like that, I'm armored when I enter into the world of people who don't love me like that, who can only love me in pieces. So I can move away from those people and see them for what they are, pity them for their inability to see with better eyes, and know myself to be okay and not dissected by them because I am whole in so many other places. And so that is how I make it through. The answer really boils down to I am loved.
Which brings us back to Morrison again, right? And she was loved, right?
And she was loved.
Same answer. Same answer. I also, one of the things that this begins, I began another project that was a lot more, that didn't take us so much to the 80s. But then when I went back to that literature, I remembered Joe's face, and I remembered what made me become an activist, what made me want to be in community. It's also about this community, about being loved. And for me, I have friends who love me and who I love, and students, but it's also my man, right? So it's also that as a 16-year-old seeing the back cover, I didn't want Joe Beam's literary prowess. I wanted Joe Beam, right? And one of the blessings of my life is that I have. I'm not gonna sing the song about Shantae has a man at home, but I gotta, because that didn't end well for Shantae. But the romantic love, the sort of partnership, 20+ year partnership, is something that grounds me, and allows me to stretch and to also be able to see that yonder they do not love your neck. And for me, yonder could be the Yale Social Science Committee. It could be my colleagues here and there. It could be a publisher. It could be, the person who says that they love me. And this is all in the literature, by the way.
That's right.
It is all in the literature. It's all in those in those archives, if you go to the Africadi archives, you go to the other country archives, you look at people's letters, what they say about each other, some kind, a lot not kind, right? But all of this history, all of this knowledge of people being together and trying to find ways to work it out is endlessly fascinating to me, and my wanting to witness all of this for the living and the dead
That's right.
is why I get up and put my pen to paper.
Whew. Thank you, Jafari. Thank you, Robert. I think we might want to end it on right where we started. What about love? Thank you so much. This was a This was a really beautiful conversation. Please know that we'll all be signing books. You can pick up The Prophets. You can pick up, there's a disco ball between us. We'll be up there with Claudia Rankin and Latasha Nevada Diggs in the book tent right about now. And thank you again for joining this conversation and being here with us. Have a
Can we
great
get
wonderful
field theories too?
Yes, you can also get field theories as well there.
I'm supposed to show it.
Oh, right.